The Sahel and Ukraine. A silent war of worlds. The two fronts of a new world order. In the north, fields of wheat burn under artillery fire. In the south, fields of millet dry under the Sahelian sun. One war is televised, mourned, and funded. The other, ignored, starved, and sanctioned. Yet somehow, the two are linked like mirrored images of a broken world system. Ukraine and the Sahel, two battlefields thousands of miles apart, now stand at the volatile intersection of geopolitics, global trade, and post-colonial rebellion. While Europe bleeds in its own backyard, Africa's Sahel is tearing up the old script, dismantling Western military bases, rejecting French control, and aligning with a new global order that no longer bows to Brussels or Washington. But make no mistake, Ukraine and the Sahel are fighting the same empire. From opposite ends of the chessboard. Two wars, one world system. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the shockwave didn't stop at Kiev. It hit the deserts of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso with invisible force. The war weaponized food, energy, and diplomacy, cutting off grain exports from the Black Sea and turning Africa's fragile import-dependent economies into collateral damage. Overnight, bread prices in Bamako doubled. In Ouagadougou, wheat shortages hit bakeries like artillery shells. The world watched Ukraine's suffering, but Africa paid the hidden price. The Sahel, already destabilized by climate change and decades of foreign military presence, suddenly found itself trapped in a war it didn't start, but couldn't escape. The EU needed Africa's uranium, gold, and migration control. Russia needed Africa's loyalty, votes, and ports. And in the middle stood nations like Mali and Burkina Faso, tired of being chess pieces. France's collapse, and the Sahel's revolt. For decades, France called the Sahel its pré carré, its private backyard. French troops fought jihadists, protected uranium mines, and kept the CFA franc tied to Paris's treasury. But when the war in Ukraine began, Europe turned inward. France's attention shifted to NATO unity, energy crises, and sanctions on Moscow. The Sahel noticed the silence. In 2022 and 2023, one by one, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger expelled French forces. What began as military coups became a geopolitical revolution. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, was born. A new bloc rejecting French neocolonialism and aligning with partners like Russia, Turkey, and China. Meanwhile, French politicians warned that the Sahel was falling into Moscow's hands. But for many Africans, that wasn't a fall. It was liberation. While Europe sent billions in weapons to Ukraine, Sahelian capitals accused Paris of hypocrisy. You call resistance heroic in Kiev, but terrorism in Bamako. The contrast became a moral earthquake. Russia's desert strategy. As Europe isolated Russia, Moscow looked south, deep into the red sands of the Sahel. Wagner operatives appeared in Mali and Burkina Faso, offering security without lectures. Russian cargo planes landed with weapons, uniforms, and advisors. In return, gold and uranium quietly flowed north. The Sahel became Russia's African flank, a pressure valve against Western sanctions, a base for resource extraction, and a propaganda goldmine. In 2023, Russian media began portraying Sahel leaders, like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, as African revolutionaries, the new Sankaras, resisting Western imperialism. Pan-African flags waved alongside Russian ones. The narrative stuck. While Ukraine fought for sovereignty from Moscow, the Sahel fought for sovereignty from Paris. Two struggles. One theme. Independence from empires. The grain war. The war in Ukraine didn't just send tanks. It sent hunger. Ukraine and Russia, together, supply nearly 30% of global wheat exports, much of it bound for Africa. When ports like Odessa closed, Africa's breadbasket went dark. The EU scrambled to replace supplies, but the prices soared. In Niger and Mali, grain shortages ignited protests. Leaders accused the West of weaponizing food. The Kremlin seized the narrative, sending small shipments of free Russian grain to Mali and Burkina Faso, a brilliant propaganda move that cost little but bought immense loyalty. Suddenly, a grain ship flying the Russian flag in a Sahelian port meant more than any speech in Brussels. Ukraine, too, tried to repair relations. President Zelensky held virtual summits with African leaders, promising to rebuild ties and provide solidarity grain. But for many Africans, it was too late. They remembered how European markets shut down their exports, how their currencies were tied to the euro, and how Western aid came with lectures about democracy, while Ukraine received unconditional billions. The message was clear. Some wars are worth the world's empathy. Others are just statistics. The media war. Who tells the story? Western media cast Ukraine as the front line of freedom, but when the Sahel expelled France, the headlines screamed, junta, authoritarian, Russian influence. In Ouagadougou and Bamako, young Pan-African influencers took to TikTok and Telegram, countering what they saw as Western propaganda. They argued that the same Western powers defending democracy in Kiev supported dictatorships in Africa for decades. One viral clip put it bluntly, when white soldiers fight invaders, they re-heroes. When black soldiers do, they re-rebels. The narrative war between the Sahel and Ukraine became a mirror of global hypocrisy. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré became a symbol. Sankara 2.0. Speaking of self-reliance, sovereignty, and dignity, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky became the West's wartime symbol of democracy. Both wrapped in military fatigues, both fighting for freedom, both used as symbols by global powers. But only one was invited to Davos. Minerals, energy, and mutual dependence. Here's the part no one talks about. Europe's energy crisis linked the fates of Kiev and Kittel, Paris and Ouagadougou. When Russia cut gas to Europe, the EU desperately sought new energy sources, from African LNG in Senegal to uranium in Niger. But when Niger's new government suspended uranium exports to France, panic hit Europe's energy sector. The Sahel suddenly had leverage. Ukraine's war exposed Europe's dependence on Russian gas, and Africa's response exposed Europe's dependence on African minerals. Behind the headlines, a quiet battle unfolded. Who controls the resources that fuel Europe's war machine? While Europe poured billions into Ukraine's defense, it offered pennies for Africa's development. While it sanctioned Russian oil, it still imported African cobalt, gold, and rare earths with little concern for fair trade. The Sahel began to see the pattern. Whether the mines were in Siberia or Burkina Faso, Europe's hunger looked the same. The new non-alignment. In the Cold War, Africa was forced to choose, East or West. In 2025, the Sahel says, neither. Traoré, Gaïra, and Tiani, leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are building what they call a sovereign Sahel. Their alliance talks about self-sufficiency, collective defense, and a new Pan-African economic bloc, one that trades freely with whoever respects their sovereignty. This echoes Ukraine's original dream of independence, before it became trapped between NATO and Russia. But while Kiev turned west, the Sahel is turning inward, toward self-reliance, food sovereignty, and regional solidarity. That terrifies the old powers. The information front. The Sahel-Ukraine tension isn't fought with bullets. It's fought with narratives. Western media outlets frame the Sahel's new alliances as Russian manipulation. African media frame Ukraine as a Western proxy. Both sides accuse the other of being puppets. Meanwhile, a new generation of African journalists and digital warriors are rewriting the narrative. They see Ukraine as a symbol, not of democracy, but of Western selective morality. Burkina Faso's youth chant, Vive la résistance, but they mean Africa's resistance, not Kiev's. This information war has become a front in itself, a war for the global South's heart and mind. The empire strikes back. Europe hasn't accepted defeat in the Sahel. Since 2024, EU and NATO planners have quietly shifted operations to coastal West Africa, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Benin, to contain what they call Sahel instability. In Brussels, analysts warn that the Sahel's alignment with Russia could open a southern corridor of influence, stretching from Libya to the Atlantic. The fear isn't jihadism anymore. It's geopolitical independence. Meanwhile, the EU tries to keep Ukraine afloat with aid and arms, while trying to keep Africa dependent with loans and lectures. But the Sahel isn't listening anymore. As one Burkina official said, Europe wants to free Ukraine from Russia, but keep Africa tied to Europe. That era is over. A volatile future. The volatile relationship between the Sahel and Ukraine is not one of hostility, but of contradiction. Ukraine represents the West's war for sovereignty. The Sahel represents the South's war for dignity. Both are fighting for freedom, but under different empires. Yet global media paints one as noble, the other as dangerous. One receives tanks, the other sanctions. But in the deserts of the Sahel, something deeper is brewing. A consciousness, a defiance that echoes through generations. When African leaders watch Ukraine receive billions for its survival, they ask, where was the world when we fought terrorism, hunger, and colonialism? And in that question lies the real fracture line of the 21st century. The world's future isn't being decided in Washington or Moscow. It's being decided in the silent deserts of the Sahel and the bombed-out plains of Ukraine. Both are reminders that sovereignty is not granted. It's fought for. Please help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Please subscribe and like if you appreciate real verified content. That is the backbone of our channel, and both show that the new world order is not coming. It's already here. The new geopolitical frontier. As the dust settles on two continents, a strange symmetry emerges. Ukraine fights to rejoin the West. The Sahel fights to escape it. Europe claims to defend sovereignty abroad, while losing influence at home. And as the old powers fade, new alliances rise. From Bamako to Moscow, from Niamey to Beijing, the world is no longer divided by ideology. It's divided by who controls their destiny. And for the first time in a century, Africa is no longer asking permission